This man is psychology professor Robert Cialdini. He has spent a long career looking at how people are influenced. Cialdini says that there are 6 different ways that people can be influenced, and each one of these on its own is very powerful. They are liking, commitment and consistency, reciprocity, social proof, authority, and scarcity. It's important to know that this framework is not based on opinion, it's based on scientific experimentation. And although this framework was devised nearly 30 years ago, other psychologists around the world and across different cultures have reproduced the results of Cialdini's experiments. We don't have time to go through each of these in detail, but what we'll do is give you an overview of what each of them means and then concentrate on the ones that have the greatest relevance for this course, which are liking and reciprocity. The first principle, and one that we'll talk about more in this video, is liking. Very simply, it says that we're more likely to be influenced by somebody that we like than somebody that we don't like. Other things being equal, we're more likely to buy from somebody that we like than somebody that we don't like. Of course, the big question is, if you want to influence somebody and you want to do it by getting them to like you, how do you get them to like you? And we'll talk about that a bit more later in the video. The second principle is commitment and consistency. We have a very strong drive for the actions and the things that we say now to be consistent with the actions and the things that we've said in the past. Now, this is something that salespeople understand very, very well. If we take a small step towards something, we're more likely to take a larger step in the same direction later on. For example, researchers went to a smart area and asked them to put a sign measuring 1 metre by 3 metres saying "drive carefully" in the middle of their front lawns. The majority of residents declined. However, with another sample, the researchers first approached the residents and asked them to put a small card in their window that simply said "Be a safe driver." When the researchers returned 2 weeks later with a sign measuring 3 metres by 1 metre saying "Drive carefully," fully 50% of residents agreed to put them in the middle of their lawn. The principle of commitment and consistency had turned a small earlier commitment into a much larger commitment later on. The third principle is reciprocity. What that means is that if we do something for somebody else, they're much more likely to do something for us. Now, this is really important when it comes to rapport, because if the other person senses that we like them, then they're much more likely to like us back. Now, the fourth principle, social proof, is probably the least intuitive and is actually probably the one that's hardest for us to accept. And the reason for that is that what social proof is really about is saying that we have a strong desire to be like other people. That, of course, isn't the way that we like to think about ourselves. But experiment after experiment shows that we have a strong desire to conform. Hotels often have a sign asking guests to reuse their towels because that's good for the environment. Cialdini's researchers changed the wording on the sign. Instead of appealing to concern for the environment, they changed the sign to say 90% of people that stay in this hotel reuse their towels. The consequence was that towel reuse increased substantially. And when they changed the sign to be even more specific and said that 90% of people that stay in this particular room reuse their towels, then the overall percentage of reuse went up yet again. People wanted to conform to what other people were doing. Social proof is now used by many organisations to nudge their customers in the direction that they want them to go. The fifth principle is authority. What this says is that we're much more likely to do something if somebody that we regard as being an authority asks us to do it. We're also much more likely to believe something if there's some sort of authority to what's being said. This video is an example of that. I'm telling you that an eminent psychologist has devised these principles based on experimental research. I'm using his authority to convince you that this is a good way to influence people. The sixth and final principle of influence is scarcity. We see this around us all of the time. There's a limited time offer. If we don't buy now, then the opportunity will be gone. There's a discount of 50%, but it's only until the end of the week. It's scarce. And that wraps up our overview of Robert Cialdini's 6 principles of influence. However, we want to return to the topic of liking because it's so important in developing rapport, particularly when liking is reciprocated. That's true rapport. So just how do you get somebody to like you? Well, let's take a look at an expert. Whether or not they agree with his politics, nearly everyone that has met ex-President Bill Clinton has said that they like him. They all say very similar things. They say, he made me feel like I was the only person in the room. He made me feel like he was genuinely interested in what I had to say. This is the key to being liked. The key to being liked is to be curious about the other person. For the other person to do most of the talking. To be really genuinely interested and show it. And when we're genuinely interested, that's reflected in our micro body language, particularly our facial expressions, those things that happen in a fraction of a second that we can't control consciously. So the key thing to remember is that we project what we feel. What we feel inside is visible outside. In what and the how other do we demonstrate that we're interested, or to find some way of demonstrating we're interested in what the other person by asking questions, by listening to the answers fully, by being present and asking more questions. Rather than interrupting the other person, we wait until they're finished speaking, and we pause after they've finished speaking to show that we're giving weight and consideration to what they've said and thinking about it. And remember what they said about Bill Clinton. He made me feel like I was the only person in the room. Give the other person your full attention. In essence, use the techniques that you've learned on this call about verbal and non-verbal communication, about things like paraphrasing and reflecting and mirroring and asking powerful questions to show that you're deeply interested in what they've got to say. And if they say something that they think is interesting, don't come back with something that you think is more interesting. If they give you an anecdote, don't come back with something which you think is an even better anecdote.